In this second eyewitness lecture, what I'd like to do is continue talking about some of the system variables that were mentioned in the last lecture. Before we get started, however, let's look at another case. I think sometimes the best way to really understand how some of these variables play out in the criminal justice system is to look at actual cases of people who have been tried and convicted. Let me introduce you to Dewey Bozzella. And let's hear watch his story first.
Program.
Prison time, you're in a box. Every second, every day, every year, every decade, there's no hope. No matter what you accomplish in there, no matter what you do in there, you're still in that box.
In 1983, Dewey Bozzella arrived at Sing Sing Maximum Security Prison, a broken and bitter man. Life had hardly been fair to him. As a 9-year-old boy in Brooklyn, New York, he'd watched his father beat his mother to death. A few years later, it was his brother, stabbed and killed in a fight. At 17, Dewey moved upstate to the small city of Poughkeepsie to get away and find a better life. A few months after he arrived, he was arrested for the murder of a 92-year-old woman. The only evidence against him was a couple of local criminals who swore he did it. But Dewey Bozzella got 20 years to life. He spent his first few years behind bars, angry and isolated. Then he discovered the prison boxing program. It was in this unlikely sanctuary of serenity that Dewey found hope.
Oh, boxing, my life. Boxing is what saved me. Boxing deals with morals, obligations, and responsibilities. And the main thing is discipline. It helped me to find that freedom I needed. That was my peace.
In the ring, life made sense, and Dewey's talent was unmistakable. He became the prison's undefeated light heavyweight champion. So impressive were his skills that a special fight was scheduled at Sing Sing against New York City's Golden Gloves champ, Lou DeVal.
It was one of those fights. It was a war.
I hit him with a good body punch. I thought I had him.
He's one of those guys who just kept picking.
He hit me with a 3-punch combination. Blood just came straight down, just like that.
The fight was stopped. I was the lucky one, because if I would have got cut, he would have probably won. I walked out of Sing Sing with like, dodged the bullet.
What I loved about it, even though it was a loss, was the fact that he's the first man to knock down Roy Jones. I can't complain. I'm happy.
Win or lose, Dewey had found his salvation in boxing, and boxing had given him the strength to embark on a much bigger fight. The fight of his life. The fight for his freedom. It began with a retrial in 1990.
We were very optimistic. Everyone in the courtroom, when the jury went to retire, had said they'll be back in a half an hour with a not guilty verdict.
The district attorney was nervous and quickly came to Dewey with a deal. If he admitted his guilt, he'd walk out of court a free man. But boxing had transformed Dewey, and in that moment he made a choice. His life would be defined by how he lived it, not where he spent it.
I'll die before I tell you I did it. I can't. You're not gonna make me say something I didn't do. Everything that I stood for, everything would have been taken away from me, everything. I can't live with you or anybody else telling me that I killed an old woman. So what do I do? What do I do as a man, you know?
For Dewey, his integrity is the most important thing, and I don't think Dewey would have been able to look himself in the mirror if he had confessed to something he hadn't done.
That choice would cost him. When somehow, with even less evidence than the first trial, Dewey was convicted again and sent back to prison. But in Sing Sing, the fighter was defiant. To Dewey Bozzella, it was simple. The only thing to do after a knockdown was to get back up.
Dewey would write to me, can we do this? Can we do that? Dewey always felt that he would get out.
My faith was based on having it inside me that I'm getting out.
He wrote Jet, Ebony, 60 Minutes. Dewey never gave up.
Dewey Bozzella had walked into prison all but forgotten by the world. But inside, he had made a choice to better it. He spent his days in the gym training his body and his nights in the classroom training his mind. earning bachelor's and master's degrees. He also married his girlfriend, Trina, all in an effort to leave the past behind. But life behind bars could make that very difficult. Never more so than the day Dewey went to the prison chapel and came face to face with the man who'd murdered his brother.
First thing I did was look him in the eyes and I asked him the question. So why'd you murder my brother? His words were to me. I was 15 years old. It was something that just happened. Right then and there, I forgave him.
Even though Dewey was behind bars, he woke up every day loving life. He would come down on a visit, smiling, laughing. That was just Dewey.
I learned to take myself from the bad position and make it a better position, because if I hold on to it, I'm just gonna burn with hatred. I ain't allowed prison to make me bitter. My attitude was that I had to make myself happy.
Even when his very innocence cost him a chance at parole 2 decades into his sentence.
Parole should have been a rubber stamp, and it wasn't, for the simple reason that Dewey wouldn't confess to a crime he hadn't committed.
I said, Trina, I'm not telling these people I did it. If I have to die in prison, that's just the way it is.
And he meant that. And that was very hard for me because I don't want to hear that. I said, Dewey, you're not coming out of here on parole. You're going to walk out the door a free man.
With Trina at his side, Dewey's determination to clear his name only got stronger. For years, he'd been writing the Innocence Project, an organization that uses DNA evidence to help the wrongly convicted. In 2003, after 20 years in prison, his persistence only grew. He wrote the same exact letter every week.
I have been writing this firm since 2001, and no one had answered my letters. So here I am writing again, asking for your help. I have for the past 26 years been fighting to prove my innocence.
Finally, 5 years after his first letter, the Innocence Project took Dewey's case. And immediately the lawyers were shocked at the injustice they discovered surrounding his 2 convictions. But disbelief turned to despair when they learned that all the physical evidence from the case had been destroyed by police. With no DNA to work with, the Innocence Project could not continue.
My heart just sunk. I knew he was innocent. I knew that if somebody just dug in there, they would find something that would overturn that conviction.
The Innocence Project referred the case to a powerful law firm in New York City, where a pair of young lawyers were willing to dig in the first criminal case of their careers.
We were facing incredibly long odds. We had lost files, we had dead witnesses.
He needed a miracle, and we needed a miracle to find something to prove that he was innocent of this 30-year-old murder.
What I did was let them see through me there's hope. Never give up attitude.
Dewey's attitude was contagious, and the lawyers started from scratch, re-examining every detail, reconsidering every clue. And though there was nothing leading them to believe that a meeting with this man, the lead detective in the murder, would help Dewey, they met with him anyway. To their astonishment, Arthur Regula handed over a copy he'd kept of the 30-year-old case file, the only file he had taken home with him when he retired.
He asked me why I kept the case file, and I told him I figured someday someone would come knocking on my door. There were certain things in the case that made me have doubts whether Dewey Bozzella was actually involved. Just could never throw it away.
This was big, this was important. This is the connection that we're looking for. This is finally something that can get him out.
And so all of a sudden, we had evidence showing that the people's witnesses were lying, that another suspect actually had confessed to the crime, and the prosecution had hid both pieces of information from Dewey for 30 years.
For more than 3 decades, Dewey had been labeled a murderer, kept behind bars for a crime he did not commit. All the while, he'd maintained his innocence. And now, the new evidence uncovered offered hope that the scales of justice might finally weigh in his favor. On a rainy day in October 2009, Dewey was brought to the same Poughkeepsie courtroom where he'd been convicted twice before.
Until I hear it, then that's when I believe it.
We've been through it all. The journey has to come to an end.
It's our position that the matter must be dismissed in the interest of justice And the people so move to dismiss the indictment.
Mr. Bozzella is ordered to be released immediately.
Tell the world I'm coming home. Let the rain wash away all the pain of yesterday.
I said, it's finally over. It's finally over.
In my heart, what I was saying is, you're my husband, and you go home with me today.
After all the years, all the way to the age of 51, I finally got my name cleared.
From the moment he walked out onto the courthouse steps, he was not angry and he wasn't going to try to point fingers.
I'm glad that it's over with. Whatever the prosecution and the police did, I'm gonna let it go because I gotta move on with my life. If I worry about what they did, I'm never gonna get anywhere where I need to go.
All those years behind bars, Dewey had been preparing for this day. The day he would be free. Free to live the life he'd fought so hard for. Today, Dewey Bozzella fights for a new generation, using his skills as a boxer to teach the values and the discipline the sport taught him in prison. He also holds on to a dream, to get back one small piece of the life that was taken from him. He wants just one fight as a free man. It'll be easy to train for, considering he's already won the most difficult fight he'll ever face.
A man's reputation is everything if he's fighting for something that's of a worthy cause. My worthy cause was my freedom.
I'm coming home. Tell the world that I'm coming home.
Pretty powerful story, right? Well, you saw at the end that Dewey Bozzella had one dream, and that was to have one fight outside of prison. Well, a few years ago, a fight promoter in Los Angeles heard about Dewey's wish and gave him his wish. And here's an article that describes the boxing match that Dewey Bozzella finally had on the outside. This was at the Staples Arena, and he was given one chance to box professionally. It was part of a multi-fight event, and he was 52 years old, and he fought a 30-year-old man and won the fight. When you look at this article right here, you see that basically, at least in the first couple of rounds, it didn't look like Bozzella was going to make it, because obviously it looked like a 52-year-old man was fighting a 30-year-old. But he really persevered, and he started to get his strength, and he was in it for the long haul, not for the short haul, and he ended up winning the fight. So there is a happy ending to this story. And here's the quote from Dewey on the night of the fight. He says, "This was my first and last fight. This is a young man's game. I did what I came to do. I appreciate what everyone did for me. This was one of the greatest moments of my life." And there he is on the night of the fight. By the way, just in case you're interested in this case, a couple of years ago, so Bozzella was willing to move on and just live his life. But of course, his attorneys convinced him that because in his case, the reason why he was behind bars was because of prosecutorial misconduct. So not just that faulty eyewitnesses, but the prosecutors actually knew that there was another person out there who had confessed to the crime. They decided to sue New York City, and of course, Bozzella just received about 2 or 3 years ago a multi-million-dollar lawsuit filed in his favor. Okay, so let's move on. Last time we talked about lineup fairness. Let's take a look at another system variable, and this is verbal overshadowing. Verbal overshadowing is this finding that when people describe a face, so, when police ask you, can you tell me what the perpetrator looked like? Well, the victim then describes the face. 6'2", had blonde hair, his eyes were closed, those kinds of descriptions, that actually it overshadows your later attempt at an identification. So for example, we later on get some people in a lineup. That description can overshadow and impair your ability to recognize the face. In fact, the original studies that were done showed that individuals who first describe a face were 1.27 times more likely to misidentify a face from the lineup. So 27% more likely to make a false identification. So this verbal overshadowing, it's not a very big effect, but it certainly seems relevant in the criminal study. About 3 years ago, in the field of psychology, they decided to try to replicate this study. So what they did was, sometimes you have some unusual studies that are published in psychology, and you want to see whether or not it really is a finding that holds up if you do it over and over again. This replication study was done in 31 laboratories around the world, and looking at whether or not they could replicate this verbal overshadowing effect. And what we basically found was, yeah, it does seem to be a real effect. The effect that the 31 labs found was not quite 27% more likely. It was 22% more likely, but certainly it is a small but significant effect. So describing a face then can later impair your ability to recognize that face in a lineup. Now, a related sort of task for a witness is creating a composite. Think, first you're describing the face, but then the police officers may ask you to help them to create a composite. And the question is whether or not creating a composite is a little bit like overshadowing. And you can see where this might be the case. And what do we know about composites? It turns out we know very, very little about composite creation and the degree to which there's overshadowing. But let's take a look at the composites in the Cotton case. Okay, this was the composite that Jennifer Thompson came up with on the night that she was raped. And here is the actual rapist. This is Bobby Poole. You can look at it. What do you think in terms of how good or how bad it is? One of the things that Jennifer seemed to pick up on was that there were very dark shadings around his eyes. And you can't really tell it, but Bobby Poole certainly has very dark, dark eyes. A slight mustache, but it looks, I don't know. I've taught this class so many years, and some people think this is a good composite, and the same number of people say, no, this is terrible. But let's just look at Ronald Cotton for a second as compared to this face. What do you think about the composite now? Well, Ronald Cotton said that when he saw the composite, he was relieved because he felt the composite looked nothing like him. But in fact, a lot of times when I ask classes about, whether the composite matches Cotton or Poole better, a lot of times people say it's actually Ronald that looks more like the composite than Bobby Poole. Of course, not all composites are, that difficult. Let me share with you a composite that probably was pretty dead on. This is Jesse Matthew Jr. And on the left is the composite that was made. Let me just tell you or remind you if you haven't ever heard of Jesse Matthew. Well, Jesse Matthew was the suspect that was captured in the disappearance of a University of Virginia student, Hannah Graham. She was killed in 2014. And the interesting thing about this person is they had this composite from a very much older case. So in 2005, a woman in Virginia was attacked at night while she was walking home, and she was sexually assaulted. What happened is that the offender was scared away when a passerby came. So the woman survived her sexual assault, and she was able to get a pretty good look at him, and this was the sketch that they put together. Well, there was another case a few years later in 2009. A young Virginia Tech student, she was last seen alive when she was leaving a Metallica concert, and her body was found several weeks later in a field. Well, the DNA from her case was matched to this particular attacker in 2005. So in 2014, when Heather Graham was killed, they were able to match the DNA yet again. So what they had was they had this composite from a previous case, and they used the composite to find Jesse Matthew Jr., and he's been charged. So you can see, I think this composite, we might agree that there are at least more sort of matchable identifications. And in fact, some people saw the composite and said, that's Jesse Matthew, and called the police. Okay, so what do we know about composites empirically? I'm going to share with you a study that I did with several of my graduate students, Andre Ken, Maggie Rankin, and Jennifer Gray, and we published it in 2014. And we were interested in people's ability to create composites. So we used this software right here. By the way, many police jurisdictions don't use sketch artists anymore. They use these computer generated faces. This particular program is called Faces, oddly enough. Okay, and what we did was we gave participants a face and let them look at it for a period of time, and then asked them to recreate the face, the photograph, using faces. During the training session, we allowed them, we had them create a face using faces, so they got some practice. So they created a facial composite of the research assistant who was doing their testing. By the way, this particular composite is supposed to be my graduate student, Andre Ken. So this is a composite that one person did that was in their practice trial representing Andre. What we were interested in is a couple of things. We were interested in age differences. So we were looking at people of different ages and their creation of composites. And so we wanted to see if there was an age trend in the ability to create good composites. Another thing that we were very interested in is creating composites of own and other race faces. Now we're going to get into this more next time, but one of the things that we've found in the psych and law field is that people are much better at identifying perpetrators of their own race than identifying perpetrators of other races or ethnicities. And this is true of everybody. So African Americans would be better at recognizing African Americans, whites to white, and both groups would be not very good at recognizing Asian Americans. So it's called the other race bias. So one of the things we were looking at was age differences, and we're looking at the own and other race bias. And we had some reasons to suspect that maybe creating composites of other races might be easier, but I really won't go into it right now. So what we did was we had 4 head and shoulder color photographs, and each person was given 2 photographs. They were given 1 African American and 1 white. Okay, so you got one of these 2 and one of these 2 faces. You looked at the face for a period of time, and then you were asked to recreate the face using a composite. And so I want to share with you the results of this study, and then I'm going to show you some of the composites that people created. So we have people in this study from age 5 all the way to 24. And so we're looking at, are there age differences? And do we see a race effect? So here's the results of our study. And this is really busy, so just bear with me for a second. One of the things I want to point out to you is that you can see that, oh, by the way, let me explain what we did. So what we did was we had participants create a composite. Okay, so I've got this composite, whatever it is. Then we had a completely different group of people who had not participated in the study. They looked at a series of pictures, and they were asked to rate how close the composite was to the target. So if a person created this face, they would see this picture here, and they would see the composite, and on a scale of 1 to 9, they were supposed to rate how similar the composite looked to the actual picture. So we get similarity ratings from other people. Now maybe the results will make more sense. Okay, let me show you right here. These are the similarity ratings across here. And as you can see, most people don't perform really well. Their similarity ratings are pretty low. Another thing to notice is that there does seem to be an own race effect. So, by the way, all of these kids, all of the participants in our study were from Laramie, Wyoming, and they were all white. So their own race faces would have been these faces. And you can see that their similarity ratings were higher than when they were doing African American faces. So we got the own race effect in the composite creation. You also see that there's a bit of an age trend here, that as you get older, you tend to get better at faces, at creating composites. Now we have a little bit of a dip down here, but that wasn't totally significant. So there's a slight increase in similarity. You get better at doing this as you get older. So those are the two major findings that we had. So if you have a child who is doing a composite, you might not want to ask a child who's a victim or a witness, you might not want to ask them to create composites, because you can see here their similarity scores were quite low. Okay. Now let's take a look at this other part that I found very interesting. One of the things I noticed was that there were huge individual differences in composite creation. So what I'm going to show you right now is a group of pictures. Now, mind you, I'm cherry picking. I pulled through all these pictures, but I just want to show you. This was these are composite pictures that were all done by 10-year-olds. So they're the same age. These kids are all the same age. And here is the target. And here's the huge variability in the faces made by 10-year-olds. As you can see, this person here seems to get pretty close in their composite creation. And this here, well, not so good. I don't think that we could ever identify them based on that. So there was these huge individual differences in being able to complete composites. Here's another group. Let me just show you this one. This is for this guy right here. Now what I'm going to be showing you is people of different ages. So they're not all 10-year-olds, just the variation. So even within age and between age, there was huge variations in these composite creations. By the way, in fact, this composite right here was made by an 18-year-old. Okay, you can see the huge variation in the ability to create these composites. Now, one of the things I have not been able to follow up on, and I would be interested in following up on, is what creates some of these individual differences. So, for example, among those 10-year-olds, they're all the same age, but you can see there's huge variability in the composite creation. And I'm wondering what kinds of abilities might be related to creating good or bad composites. And that's something I'd certainly like to follow up on. Well, the study that I just shared with you is one of the first to look at composite creation, and that's something that we haven't really spent a lot of time in Psych and Law doing, but we certainly need to. And as I mentioned earlier, the question about whether creating a composite is kind of like overshadowing, we don't know that because no one has tested it yet. So we've got a lot more to learn about how composites work in our criminal justice system. I'm going to stop right here, and we'll pick it up next time and talk about lineup procedures and all the rest of the system variables. Thank you.